Welcome, Will Barlow, back to Restitutio. So glad to talk with you today.
Glad to be back, Sean.
Today, we're talking about science and scripture, obviously, but in particular, earth science and the flood. Let me ask you this, just to start things off. Why did you do a whole episode on earth science?
Well, in my mind, there are three major branches of science. You've got physics and astronomy, you've got, sort of biochemistry, and then you've got geology and earth science. And I think, we can see all three of those sciences interact with the biblical text in various ways. And I knew I wanted to talk about the flood, and I knew I wanted to talk about plate tectonics. And so to do that, we have to talk about rocks. We have to get into the discussion of geology a little bit, and atmospheric sciences as well, because these are things that come in play when we think about some of the implications of the flood. Like the long lifespans and what the early atmosphere looked like versus what our atmosphere looks like. And there's all these open questions because we just can't go back in a time machine and look at what life was like back then. But at any rate, geology gives us a lot of levers and ways to look at these things, levers to pull and ways to look at these things. So that's why I wanted to spend a whole 30-minute session on it.
Yeah. I noticed you didn't get into the topic of climate change. These video interviews are my opportunity to make you uncomfortable. So I see that as basically my goal and purpose here. So let me just ask you out of left field here. What's your take on the whole topic of climate change? Have you looked into that science? Of course, they used to call it global warming, and then they changed it to climate change. Like, what are your thoughts on all that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I've looked at it some. I wouldn't consider myself an expert. Certainly not enough to make like a pretty official prognostication or prediction about where I think we'll be in 5 or 10 years or something like that. Do I think that humanity is taxing the earth in various ways? Yes. I mean, I think that's pretty much incontrovertible. We are certainly adding, carbon, and we're certainly, doing things to the atmosphere and to the world. We produce nuclear waste. We produce different gases. Our trash fills up large portions of the earth, and it leaks into the groundwater, and it affects ecosystems. And we're definitely affecting the world around us, and not in positive ways in many cases. Do I think that the world is going to end because of climate change? No. I don't think that anything that we do is going to hasten Christ's return or force God's hand on any of those things. Most likely. I mean, I guess there's possibility of like nuclear war or something like being one of the precipitating events that leads to Christ's return or something. I don't know, but by and large, from a climate change perspective, I don't think that anything that we're doing is going to ultimately lead to our demise. Do I think that at times, especially in modern science, I feel like isn't as pure as it used to be a couple hundred years ago, 200 or 300 years ago? I think people are pressured to get grants and to get funding, and you have to follow sort of where the money goes. And do I think that more is being made of certain things, and the backroom deals are being made with like failing green companies? And there's sort of a complicated web when you start looking into the climate change stuff. But the bottom line is, I do think something is happening. I don't think that it is as terrible as what some people are saying. I think we're certainly having an impact on the environment, but I don't think we're going to end the world because of it.
Yeah. I think for me, the principle of stewardship applies whether or not the world is getting warmer, and learning to steward the fruits of the Industrial Revolution is something that we still haven't mastered as as people. And I think it is appropriate for Christians, and I'm not so worried about giving advice to the rest of the people in the world because they're playing by different rules, But as a pastor and as somebody who's part of a Christian community, I do have something to say about what Christians think. And I think as Christians, we have been given the world in Genesis chapter 1, and we're told to be fruitful and multiply. Mission accomplished. We've been told to have dominion. And if we know anything by how God runs things and how God interacted with Israel and how he interacts through Christ with, the apostles and the church, that we could say God is not a domineering user, but he does have authority, and he does exercise authority and power, and he does it in a gracious way that's life-giving. And I think if we're going to pattern our stewardship, our dominion after God's example, then we don't want to just rape and pillage the earth, leaving it a wasted husk and move on to another planet as if we're like some sort of parasite. And I think, as Christians, we really should be the ones that are asking the question about, like, how can we live more sustainably? Not because necessarily there's a prediction of, global warming or some scientific, like the science is almost like irrelevant for us as Christians. Like, we should treat the place well because God gave us that responsibility. We wouldn't make a big mess in our front yard, right? Because we own that, if you own the property in particular, I'm thinking, because you own that. So I don't know, that's kind of like my approach on it. I did watch the Al Gore movie back in the day, An Inconvenient Truth. And I remember there was all this controversy over that movie among my Christian brothers and sisters, saying, oh, it's just propaganda. Al Gore's an evil Democrat. Don't listen to a word his lying face says, this kind of just extreme vitriolic hatred of the guy. And it's like, I watched it because I wanted to be informed. And I watched it, I'm like, dude, these are all scientific data points he's giving. There was one scene where he's on the airplane and he's like, oh, I can't believe I lost the election. But other than that, it was all science. And, I think as Christians, we can easily get sucked into the politics and, these kind of I don't know what you call them, but blinding ourselves. It's well, look, let's look at the data, but let's also remember the Bible is supposed to be our guide. So we should be pro taking care of the world anyhow. Absolutely. And what, sorry, I'm kind of rambling here, Will, but you got me thinking, what sort of people would God want to rule the world in the age to come? People that just trash the place?
Right. Yeah.
So I think even our kingdom hope should inform how we do it. And some people say, oh, well, if you're a real Christian, you drive an electric car. If you're a real Christian, you live off the grid, or you live in some radical, sustainable way where you recycle your urine, or I don't know. I'm just, there are people that have these strong commitments. I went to a conference once where this lady said, I only wash my hair once a month because I don't want to waste water. And I was just, there are people that go to these extremes with it. And I'm not in that camp. Although I do drive an electric car, but it's also a gas car. So I'm not really innocent there either. So I don't know, a lot of thoughts there. Did you want to come back on any of those points?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of these discussions are difficult too, because I used to work, for example, at a company that made the big wind turbine blades. So the big wind farm blades. You have to have blades to have wind turbines and to have wind energy. And the truth of the matter is that manufacturing process takes a lot of time. It requires a lot of chemicals and things that are bad for the environment. It produces waste that's bad for the environment. And then the blades themselves can disrupt, bird migration and cause problems with different ecosystems in that way as well. You talked about electric cars. To produce an electric car, the batteries for electric cars requires tons and tons of mining and that also burns fossil fuels. It also causes a devastating impact on the environment, often in Africa and in places where there's not a lot of visibility about what actually is going on. There could be child labor implications on those things as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think this is like there's no like easy button to push. It's like there's all these bad options. It's like, how do you navigate all these, which is the best of the bad options, really? I'm not trying to let people off the hook, because I think we should be intentional. I think you're absolutely right. We should steward it, steward the earth. My big pet peeve, since we're getting on soapboxes in this particular interview,
I did find a couple there, didn't I?
My big pet peeve is when I see, and it's not just because it ends up in my yard. These do end up in my yard, but I get upset about it when it happens when I'm driving down the road. But when I'm driving down the road and I see a smoker flick their cigarette butt just out the window, it's one of my hugest pet peeves. Like, that's not going to degrade. It's just going to, it's going to be there forever, wherever you put it, or it's going to find its way into the water. It's going to do something. And it's just like, why are we not planning ahead? If you're a smoker, please just keep it in your car until you get someplace, put it in a little baggie or something and throw it away in the trash. Don't just flick it everywhere, in my yard included, but also anywhere, really.
Yeah, they also have some folks will throw their fast food out the window.
Oh yeah,
garbage,
or bottles. Yeah.
So I think as Christians we can think about stewardship, and I don't want to legislate any rules here, but I think at least having a positive attitude towards our environment, and being able to think through these things. Well, let's come back to geology. Would that be all right?
Sure.
So you talk about uniformitarianism, which I think is a really key concept for young Earth creationists in particular. And that's where, and I just actually had a conversation about this yesterday, that's where you see this little creek trickling through a deep valley. And the scientists will measure the rate at which erosion is occurring and then calculate backwards. Okay, this little creek has been here for 20 trillion years, because like it only takes one atom a month away or whatever. And it's like, dude, how are you going to assume, young Earth creationists point this out, that how are you going to assume that the rate of erosion has always been so low as you see it in the present? What about catastrophes? And, as those of us who do believe in the Bible, there's this flood idea. It's pretty clear that there's a flood, and a flood would hasten. And it's not like that would be the only flood in all of history either, necessarily, as far as like at least a local flood in that region. So when it comes to this assumption of uniformitarianism, a lot of the aging stuff has to assume that in order to get to a conclusion. Do you think that that's a valid assumption in some cases, but not others? Or what's your take on this idea?
Yeah, I tend to think that it's one of those things that is generally helpful, and it's something that we probably need in a lot of cases to come to some scientific conclusions about whatever it is we're trying to study, like the creek and the canyon, or whatever example you want to use. But I also think that there are several very obvious examples of where catastrophes took place, and where things just drastically changed overnight. Like I think I mentioned in the actual episode in the class, the island that comes up off the coast of Iceland and looks pretty geologically advanced, and it literally happened like in the 70s or 80s or something like that. Like just popped out of the sea and looks like it's thousands, if not millions of years old, and it's only like 10, 20 years old. And so we see these events, and I think it arms the young Earth creationists with a lot of ammunition. I think rightfully so. I think that there is a lot. I think in terms of scientific assumptions, it's one of the weaker ones that any of the sciences really make.
Yeah. But I think they have to do it though, right?
They have to. I mean, if they don't, because science is all about observation, testing hypotheses.
Yeah.
And if you can't observe the actual catastrophe, then you're sort of left with, well, how do I explain this in a reasonable manner? Again, same thing with plate tectonics. the plates are only moving at the fastest like a foot a year, maybe max 6 inches, something in that range. Some of the plates are moving like 3 inches a year, or 2 inches a year, or an inch a year. And we're talking about huge, huge plates that are moving super slowly. And so if you extrapolate that backwards, that's where you end up with like 300 million years of tectonic separation getting us where we are now, and having sort of like a Pangea or a supercontinent before all that. And it's like, what else are you supposed to do? All we can do is observe what we see right now. And if there was like a more rapid plate tectonic kind of a separation, what would that have looked like for the life on the Earth? And what are the implications of that? And I think you have to, on some level, assume uniformitarianism to make some sort of conclusions, but I think you have to hold them with sort of an open hand and say, well, we're making quite a bit of, a lot of assumptions here.
Well, when I think about the two areas where we Christians get really skeptical about science, they're predicting the future and post-dicting the past. When a scientist measures something in a vial, and they do their work, and they apply the method and all that goes along with trial and error, which is really all science is just trial and error and observation and predicting and then testing hypotheses. I'd say most Christians are fine. There's just like this idea that science is good, and it produces results that are helpful for medicine and technology, right? Communications, whatever, transportation. But then at the moment a scientist says, well, based on my current findings, I predict that all the ice caps are going to melt by the year 2000 or by the year 2015. And here we are in 2022, and we're just like, well, you didn't get that right.
Didn't happen. Right.
And then, the same thing about the past. It's like, well, based on our current observations, this thing has been going on for this many, those seem to be the two areas where the science is extrapolating beyond its actual data set to the past or the future, where we Christians are just like, you know what? I hear what you're saying, and I don't question the math. It's just the assumptions underneath it all, that there's never been a big flood, or that there's never some way to leach this out or put more in, or some sort of disturbance in the system. You're always assuming a closed system. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but like that seems to be like those are the areas where Christianity and science are like boom, 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 boom. Whereas like if it's talking about the science of designing a computer chip, the materials engineering that goes into that, there's no controversy over that, right? There's no Christian group that's like, oh, I don't believe in computer chips. That's not a thing.
No, I think you're right. I think when it comes to climate change, to give an example of like the ice cap situation, I think various both Christian scientists and maybe other people as well have pointed out that just a small reduction in like solar activity would more than compensate for all of the stuff that we're supposedly adding to the environment. And so, and in fact, I've read a couple of papers that have suggested that we're long overdue for an ice age. And in the 50s and 60s, they were talking about global cooling. They weren't talking about global warming. They were worried about global cooling. And then with all the automobiles and with the increased farming practices and with all the things that have happened in the last 50, 60 years.
And the cows.
And all of that. We've fought off this ice age that's long overdue. And so who knows if this isn't, a good thing for humanity as a general, in the short term. Again, long term, I think there are implications that we can't ignore. And I think your stewardship piece is totally apropos. But I just think that what you're describing here, and the reason why, as someone who does statistics at least for a living for the next day or two, before I'm a full-time pastor next week. But when the more variables you have in a problem, and the more range of possible values each of those variables has, the least predictive your model can be. You have, if you think about like this variable has this range, and this variable has this range, and this variable has this range, when you start multiplying them together, the range starts getting pretty big. And so I think when people make, a lot of times, especially with the climate science stuff, people have been making these bold predictions to get people's attention, to sort of wake them up. And instead, I think they should have just said, we're not going to have ice caps in the year 2075. That, to me, if that's what your model actually says, if you look at all the possibilities and you actually sort of do the statistical analysis very concrete, very, very concretely, don't take the low part of that range. Don't like cherry pick 2015, because then if it doesn't happen, you look like an idiot and then no one's going to believe you.
Yeah.
And maybe the more realistic model answer was 2075. If we stay at this rate, accounting for solar activity possibly getting better over a couple of years here and there.
Yeah.
And the fluctuations of all these different variables happening in positive ways and not just like taking the worst case scenario kind of a approach. And I think that's gotten people into trouble, and it has led science to be less credible in some people's eyes. And I think that's sort of what you get for putting a bad prediction out there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a tough problem to predict. It's a tough problem to deal with the public, public relations side of it, persuasion, and it's just been so badly mishandled that there's been just like a lot of unnecessary, like you said, overconfidence, and then these predictions happen. This also kind of relates to the whole radiocarbon dating. That's the process by which a parent atom like carbon-14 turns into a daughter atom, carbon-13, and then carbon-12. So this dating system has come under scrutiny due to dating items of known age and finding them to be thousands of years old when they're not that old. Or we saw this too, young Earth creationists point this out, with Mount St. Helens. They'll take the igneous rock and do, I don't know if it's Argon-Potassium or lead dating, or it's not carbon, but whatever the isotope is there. And they find these rocks to be millions of years old. And we know, like, people are alive today who saw the eruption. It was in 1980. We know that rock is exactly however many years old, 20 years old, 40 years old, whatever. And when they did the test, and they get these wild millions of years old answers. So what do you think is going on there? It seems like there's a lot of confidence in radiocarbon dating, other radiometric dating, and when we can test it, it doesn't seem like it pans out. So do you think it is? I know you think it is legit still. So maybe you could just explain what do you think is going on here?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've already talked about a little bit the uniformitarianism and the downstream implications of that, which all the radiometric stuff is sort of based on sort of a uniformitarian approach, a statistical approach. Assuming that things behave in a very specific way. And so when you have a volcanic eruption, that's a catastrophic event. That's something that, is outside the norm. And so I would say that that's a large part of what maybe is confusing the dating methods. There could be things that we haven't quite pieced together about how things react to, things in volcanic eruptions. That's another possibility. But, I think at the end of the day, I think, I've read some articles that have talked about all the different, radiometric dating of all the different things that we've dated before. And it's like you have like a room full of 1,000 clocks. And if you look at what they all say the time is, the question is how confident that we can be that this sort of like average of all of them is sort of correct. And so when you think about like on a macro scale, I'm not going to address specific examples necessarily, but on a macro level, should we, why am I an old Earth creationist and not a young Earth creationist? One of the reasons is because when you look at all the different things all around the world, all the different things we date, all the different methods we use, all the different clocks in the room, so to speak, they all tend to agree with a very old Earth, a couple billion years old at least. And as you critique these assumptions, there's only, again, like I talked about with statistical modeling earlier, let's say each of the variables that you're questioning has a specific range.
Right.
If you're a young Earth creationist and you take sort of like the best case scenario for like the young Earth view all the way across the board, you don't end up with an Earth that's 4 billion years old. That's true. You do not end up with an Earth that's 4 billion years old. You end up with an Earth that's like 40 million years old. you can't get to 6,000 years,
Right.
even taking the best case scenario from all these different fields,
Mm.
all these different assumptions. And so you still end up like way older than you want to be from a young Earth creationist perspective.
And as a young Earth creationist, you're looking at taking over and over again every time you take that lower end, there's like a certain chance that you could be wrong. And
Absolutely.
you're multiplying those chances one upon the other. You're increasing the probability you're wrong. Correct. Every time you only take that one bottom end. And so by the time you're done, you end up with something that's so unlikely to be correct that it starts to seem like a conspiracy.
Right.
And I think that's a good indication that you're on the wrong track. Now, I know a lot of my brothers and sisters who are young Earth creationists, and I know a lot of folks that are, and I respect them, and believe that they're make some really good points. But they're going to come back and say, well, it is a conspiracy by the devil to make us question the Bible. Right. How would you respond to that kind of thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I think that all hinges on our interpretation of Genesis, like we've been talking about. And so if young Earth creationism is what Moses, what God essentially planted in Moses's mind, if you want to view it that way, yeah, that's, for me, that's the huge assumption that's underpinning that theology, that theological standpoint. Because like there was a book put out recently called "In the Beginning We Misunderstood," where two young Earth creationists went back to Genesis and they realized that the assumptions that they were putting into Genesis weren't necessarily the best ancient Near East assumptions to use, and they basically both moved to a non-literal, view of Genesis 1 from being staunch young Earth creationists and going to the text as biblical scholars to try to prove young Earth creationism sort of for once and all. They actually changed their view after thinking about how ancient Near Eastern people thought about things. And we spent a lot of time in the class and a lot of time in earlier conversations talking about all these different views of Genesis 1. If the only view that at the end of the day that stands, if we can somehow knock out all these other views and we know that with 100% certainty that young Earth creationism is correct, then yes, I would agree with them. Using those assumptions, I would say that yes, all these scientific things, it could be a conspiracy by the devil to make things look weird, and make things look older than they really are and get us to doubt the integrity of the Bible. But I don't, first of all, and we've talked about this before, but I think it puts a lot of power in the devil's hands that he can.
Yeah, this goes back to the topic you raised early on.
Yeah. And so, I think again, my stance on this is that there are two or three other explanations that we can go to that are not young Earth creationism. But even if we do think that Moses, and I know I've said this before, but just to say it again, even if we do think that Moses thought of things as young Earth, like he thought that the universe was only 6,000 years old and he thought that the Earth was only 6,000 years old, even if Moses believed that, it doesn't mean that we have to. Even if that is in his mind or in the worldview of the people around him, that doesn't mean that we have to agree with them. And that's not an integrity of the Bible issue. That's a question of interpreting the Bible and making sense of it in light of all this other information that I think God is giving us from science. So, but that's an assumption that I'm making, that science is good.
Well,
that, that the assumptions we make in science can help us.
Yeah. Also, your point from earlier on is that it calls into question God's character. Yes. If he allows Satan to so infect the world with deception, that the application of our God-given faculties, mental and physical faculties, are going to all tell us a lie. And you brought this up with the starlight as well.
Absolutely.
And if you could say, oh, it's the devil, but like, there's also a God component here, because God can stop the devil from going too far. I think all Christians would agree with that, right? So, is it really, isn't it really an attack on God's character also, not just the devil, that all these clocks are wrong?
Totally.
That honest-hearted, totally willing to go one way or another kind of person is going to be deceived by the evidence that God would make a world that's like that.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's it. And I think, some of our friends are probably thinking about, like the theological implications of a similar situation in theology when you think about like the history of the Trinity, for example. And almost everyone believes in the Trinity, in modern Christianity. So it's like, can all those people be deceived? It's just like the young earthers would say, can all these scientists be deceived? Is there a conspiracy here? And the difference, I think, between these two is that if you look at the evidence in the Bible for the Trinity, all the evidence is there. It's all preserved. You can weigh for yourself what the evidence for the Trinity or against the Trinity is. And as two people who don't believe in the Trinity, we think that the evidence is very heavily stacked in our direction. So in that case, the evidence hasn't been tampered with. Or when it has, like, for example, in the 1 John 5, the verses that are in the King James, we can see that they were added, that the devil did try to add evidence to weigh it the other way a little bit. And it got taken out of modern Bibles because they can see that the manuscripts from earlier don't include it. And so I think, again, we're not talking about the majority wins kind of a mentality. I'm not, to use William Lane Craig's line from his recent discussion with Dale Tuggy, I'm not just counting noses. I'm not just saying I'm right because we're counting noses. I think he was actually in that instance. He was counting noses. But I'm not saying we should do whatever the majority thinks, whether that's the majority of scientists, or whether that's majority of people believing the Trinity, whatever the case might be. What I'm saying is, if we look at the evidence, the different data points we actually have, and we line them all up, what kind of trend do we see? Do we see an old Earth or do we see a young Earth? And when it comes to certain scientific disciplines like astronomy and like the dating aspects of geology, most scientists that are Christians in those realms are not young Earth creationists, and that's the reason why, because they look at those data points every day, and they have a lot of belief in that the science is pretty accurate on them.
Yeah, and I think your unique perspective, being a statistics guy, is really helpful here, because a lot of us are not approaching it from a probability perspective, and that's really probably the best overarching approach, rather than getting stuck on one little corner of like ice cores, for example, and it's like, well, they found this plane and 250 feet of ice, and it's like, okay, so from your more statistical approach, you're like, all right, so that's an anomaly that calls into question the rate of deposition, but we have these 700 other data points in addition to that one data point, and this one is not going to overturn all of these. Like it's going to call into question our confidence or our assumptions about rates and stuff and so on, but it's not strong enough to overturn the whole science of counting ice cores or whatever. So I think that's really helpful. Let's just because we're kind of winding down here, let's talk about the flood of Noah, for you gap theorists who believe in multiple floods, which I don't even know what you're talking about there, but we don't need to get into it if there's some other flood. But let me ask you this, local or global?
So I tend to take a global flood approach. And I think I said that in the class. I'm not saying that the other view is impossible. I also, for the purpose of the class, just limited to those two options. I think there is a third option that, it's an allegory, or many Christians, like our friends who are theistic evolutionists especially, will pull the lever that everything before Abraham is sort of story, and that when you start with Abraham, that's where the history of the Bible really begins. And so they look at allegorical interpretations of all that. And I didn't mention that in the class, but that's a lever you can pull too. You can take a non-literal
the Jordan
approach
Peterson lever.
Right. Yeah.
He looks at it as myth.
Right.
And he's like kind of like a classic 1800s liberal Christian point of view. Which, with respect to Dr. Peterson, he should really check the the subsequent history of all those groups that went in that direction. They all basically died out or are in the process of dying out. So I don't know if that's really a good move to make, but like, it's the idea of looking at it all as myth, but like in a positive sense, like archetypal myths that are really important for us to understand and live by. So it's not an antagonistic myth like, oh, that's a stupid story they made up. It's more like, no, this is a story based on God's inspiration, and people, I don't know if Peterson would recognize that, but certainly recognizing that people, this is coalescing a lot of data, a lot of human experience into one story that can be helpful as an oral history passed down to help us in making decisions. And that's kind of like his shtick, if I were to summarize it. So it's definitely not a dead position, because he's gaining followers, seems like every day. But that's an interesting view. But I don't think you're approaching it from that angle, right?
No, yeah, I like the global flood
So you
view.
tend more to the global flood.
Yeah, I tend to, and again, the reasons I outlined in the class, I think are basically it. That we look at the text. The text talks about a pretty remarkable amount of water. It talks about how long the boat was afloat. It talks about how all humankind and all animal kind was destroyed. And then you look at the description of what the Ark could have been, and I've been to the Ark experience. It's here in my home state of Kentucky. I just went recently, and it's impressive. And it's an Answers in Genesis operation. It's a young Earth creationist operation. So I don't agree with everything they say. They have tiny dinosaurs on the Ark and stuff like that. And I don't agree with all that. But even accounting for dinosaurs on the Ark, there's enough space on the Ark to handle every kind. And then again, there are implications for evolution once you get off the boat in a global flood view. In a global flood view, you have to have pretty wild separation of a species after they get off the Ark. So I don't know if you'd call that speedy microevolution or what you'd call that, but we have to end up with a lot of speciation pretty rapidly after the flood for that to work.
Yeah.
And again, there's no problem with that. If you believe in God, you think that could totally happen. So but
what about all the poop?
They had so it was really cool. You should visit sometime. But
yeah,
they had these like troughs, like in the cages on the Ark, and at the back of the cages they had these troughs that were like like gutters for poop, and they would go down into a certain part of the ship, and then you could shovel it out or do stuff.
Interesting.
With it or or burn it as fuel or whatever.
I don't know if I got that from that Steve Nye debate against Kinham. Remember that one?
No.
Yeah, there's a big debate on young Earth creationism versus Steve Nye. I think Steve Nye, the Bible guy, or not the Bible guy, the science guy. Bill Nye.
Yeah, I've heard of that debate. I've seen it, but I haven't seen it. I've seen that it exists, but I haven't.
Oh, okay. So I remember listening to that, and he brought up all these objections to the flood. I just can't remember what they all were. But I think poop was one of them. Like, how do you deal with that much waste? And then like feeding, you got to feed these animals. But I suppose from a Christian point of view, we could always say God did something to make it easier.
Hibernation is a big one.
Hibernation, put them all to sleep. And the text doesn't say one way or another how everything happened. So it's kind of like fair game to either look at scientific or engineering possibilities, or to say, oh, there was some miracle that happened there. Presumably, if God is going to flood the entire earth, he's capable of doing a great many other things to make it possible for these animals to make it through on the Ark. So the other point you made in the class was that a local flood couldn't account for how many days the boat was afloat, 40 days, or no, 1 year, floating for 1 year, right?
1 year. Yeah. I mean, again, you take the biblical description, and if you take it literally, and again, I hate to use that word literally because it's so loaded, but if you take it at face value, then you end up with, I think, a global flood. Is there a way to get a local flood out of it? Yeah, maybe. I think, again, the strongest evidence for the global flood beyond the scientific stuff, which, again, Morris and Whitcomb spent a lot of time in the Genesis flood arguing for the scientific evidence for it. And I don't agree with all their evidence because they're young Earth creationists. And I think that, canyons and other things could have existed before the flood, and all that. But, the idea that, that you have these flood myths all over the world, it seems hard from a historical. If you were just a historian and you go around the world and you look at all these different people groups that have a flood myth, and you look at where they are in the world, it just seems odd that they all have a flood myth in the same period of time, you know.
Yeah.
And some of them even like use words similar to Noah. Like some of them even use names similar to Noah. And so I just, from a historical perspective, it just seems odd to me that that would be the case if at least all humankind wasn't affected. And that gets you to at least a local or global flood view. The local flood view being that all humanity lived in that little Mesopotamian pocket when the flood happened, and somehow they didn't escape, even though the water only went up, a couple 100 feet or whatever the local flood proponents would say. And they couldn't get like over the mountains and into another area that wasn't affected by it. But I think the fact that all the people, basically every people group in the world has a flood myth, tells you that it probably happened, and it probably was global, at least in person impact. And again, that just would at least disqualify the mythic interpretation of Noah's flood. And again, you want to pull that lever, that's fine too. I know I've got great friends that believe that, so I'm not knocking that, not saying it's impossible, but the people that want to believe in a global flood, there's evidence for it, for sure.
So you're pretty convinced.
I mean, you asked me this about like the age of the universe, and I was like, I'm like 55% sure, and you're like, what? Yeah, I mean, I'd say I'm like 65% sure it was a global flood.
Man, for Will Barlow, that's a high percentage. Must be really good evidence. Oh my goodness. All right. Well, anything else on this topic of geology, earth science, meteorology, the flood that we should mention?
No, I just think it's fun to think about these things. And again, there's some great resources out there, and a lot of them come from our friends at Answers in Genesis. They've thought a lot about the flood. And so I encourage people to go take a look and see what they say, and see what other groups have to say about all these issues, because there's a lot of great work that's been done out there, and a lot of people have been thinking deeply about, lifespans and all the other implications of the flood that I just sort of teased at the very end. So that's my encouragement, is if you're interested, if this piques your interest, hopefully it does, that you'll go down some rabbit trails and really think about it some more. But at the end of the day, it is what it is. The history is what the history is, and it doesn't affect, whether we believe in Jesus or not. And so
yeah, certainly still interesting to think about.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks for your time today, Will.
Thanks, Sean.